Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is April Rinne. Those of you who have followed the show know that Grace Under Pressure focuses on what's too often referred to as the soft stuff. You know, the caring, the commitment we exert for others. And when you do it as a leader, as you will discover that April is, you do it to bring people together for common cause, and you energize the organization for the good. Welcome, April Rinne. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, John. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. I want to tell folks all about you. April is a change navigator. I love that term. She helps individuals and organizations rethink and reshape their relationship with, you guessed it, change, uncertainty, and a world in flux. I don't know where she came up with those ideas, you know. I mean, we live in a world of constant stability. Anyway, she's a graduate of Harvard Law. Wow. And she's the author of a new book called Flux: 8 Superpowers for Thriving in Constant Change. She's a member of the World Economic Forum, and a whole bunch of other things. She's consulted with organizations. Name one, she's done it. Highlights are Airbnb, Nike, Intuit, World Bank, Interdevelopment Bank, and she's also done a lot of consulting for nations, among them Singapore, South Africa, and my grandparents' native land, Italy. So she's a futurist and a widely respected speaker, and she is a provocative thinker that will challenge our assumptions. So welcome, April. It is an honor to have you on the show. So
thank you so much, John.
Great. So you have in the title of your book is Flux. What is flux? What's the theory behind it?
Yeah. Well, so the word flux, let's just spend 30 seconds on that. The word flux is both a noun and a verb. So as a noun, the word means continuous change. And I think we can all relate to that. But as a verb, the word to flux means to learn to become fluid. And I love that because there's a kind of like the world is in flux and we all need to learn how to flux.
I love the fact I never knew it was a verb. So thank you for educating me.
It's fun. It's a kind of word and it's fun to say and people get intrigued by it. And I always do give the caveat. I know that we are living very much in a world in flux right now, but I didn't write the book about 2020 or a pandemic. I've been working on it for about 3 years, since 2018, but it's more like 3 decades in the making. And I've been really fascinated in peeling back the layers of the onion on this concept of our relationships to change and why humans have such a hard time with change, particularly changes we don't control. And yet when we look to the future, there's more, not less of that on the horizon.
Right.
And so the basic premise of flux is that in a world of constant change, that we need to radically reshape our relationship to uncertainty in order to have a healthy and productive outlook.
You are so correct. And just taking a beat here, the year 2020, as a colleague of mine said, we didn't have one significant event. We had 5, the pandemic, the global economic fragility, social and racial injustice, heightened awareness of climate change, and an unsettled electoral process, all of them in 1 year. So that was pretty tough. So your book could not come at a better time, April. So
well, and I'll pick up on that very briefly and say, indeed, I could not have scripted a better time for my book to publish. But what's interesting is if I had tried to predict that, I would have gone against my own advice, which is that we can't predict the future. We can't control what's going to happen. We actually just have to put good ideas into the world when we see the need. And I will say that, the book isn't about the last 20 months, but the last 20 months have been incredible validation and acceleration of my ideas. So I'm grateful in this weird, I don't wish the last 20 months had happened either, but I actually think it's both a wake-up call, but also a warm-up for the kinds of flux and unknowns that we have ahead.
I think you are so correct. I gave a lecture to college students the other day, and I was talking about hinges of history and how things change. And if I tell you that the Romans, the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, it's a fact in history. And when I tell you that that 9/11 was a catastrophic event for our country, you can feel it viscerally. And then I looked out at the audience. These were 20-year-olds. They have no recollection of 9/11. Then I was thinking more deeply, and this what gets into Flux. They've experienced 9/11, the Great Recession of 2008, and now the pandemic. So in their short life, 20 years or so, 3 significant events. So they need your book.
Yeah, well, and thank you for bringing this up, because, the book, it's interesting. On the one hand, it's walking a fine line between business and leadership and what does this mean for organizational change, but also very much in the personal growth. I'm not a self-help expert. That's not my background, but there's very much, this all boils down to our self-awareness and our inner relationship to change. Not what we're doing in the outside world, but what grounds us internally. And the youth piece is really so I have a huge desire to reach and work with more young people. I do some already, but what I love, and this feeds directly into this notion of the theory of flux and how are we grappling with all of this, you could say that young people are much more attuned to flux because their life has been defined by it, right? But
without question.
But it doesn't mean they're necessarily better at navigating it. What they're good at doing, and this relates to the premise of what I'm trying to uncover, they're really good at calling out, hey, we've all been living by what I call these scripts, the narratives and norms and stories that describe the world we expect to live in and our place in it. And it's things like study hard, get good grades, go to college, get a job, retire, climb the corporate ladder. Success is going to be found when you make a lot of money. I mean, these are scripts, right? I'm not saying they're good or bad, they're scripts.
Yeah.
And what we're finding is that the world that we were told we were supposed to live in, if we followed the rules and did certain things, doesn't align very much at all with the world we're actually inhabiting. And young people are noticing this and saying, this is not acceptable. We have to level up. We have to think and do things differently. And so Flux is part of that conversation too.
That's great. Well, you have something called the new Flux Mindset. Would you describe that, please?
Yeah. So a flux mindset, it really does boil down to this notion of our relationship to change. And people keep asking me, they're like, oh, you wrote a book about change or change management. And I'm like, no, with all due respect to change management, this is not a book about how we manage and strategize and that sort of thing. This is about our relationships to change, how we think about it, feel about it, how we speak about it, the concepts and rituals we develop around it, and so forth. And a flux mindset, which very few people have, and I didn't have most of my life, and I'm still working on it, right? This is a lifetime practice. A flux mindset is that state of mind that can see all change. And here, I mean, change you opt into and change you really resist, change you want to have happen and change you don't expect, like the whole lot of it. A flux mindset sees all change as an opportunity for growth and learning and improvement. It doesn't see it as a threat, but it doesn't see it as something we're supposed to resist. It's able to lean into uncertainty precisely because it's not trying to make it something different.
I'm glad you talked about that because there are people who, in my world of executive coaching or in teaching, I see a lot of people who we use the word change agents, and they say they embrace change. Surveys, the self-assessments, they will say, will show that kind of stuff. But whether they do personally, I don't know. But on the other hand, the way you're describing this is, it's almost inevitable. So get over it.
Let me put it this way. Change is complicated. It's messy. So humans tend to love change we opt into. A new relationship, a new job, a new adventure, a new haircut, right? We love that kind of change. We tend to really resist change we can't control. So the kind of change that blindsides you on a Tuesday afternoon, it goes against your expectations, it disrupts your plans, right? That's the kind of change there's more, not less of. I mean, candidly, there's both, but it's that kind of change that we have to get better at. And also keep in mind, a change that's really easy for you might be really hard for me, and vice versa. We know that more change is around the corner Yet knowing that often freaks us out, right? So it's complicated. When you talk about being a change agent, it's almost invariably the change you can opt into. We're not talking about that change that like just whacks you sideways on a random afternoon. One other way that I've heard people talk about it, which I kind of enjoy, because I'm researching this stuff all the time, not only the noun and the verb, but also that speaking of nouns and verbs, that humans love change. We hate being changed. So we love the noun, we hate the verb, kind of thing, which is
That's great. Yeah. That's great. Well, you mentioned something. We opt for, we embrace. Okay. But change that is thrust upon us, we don't. And we're living through that right now in our pandemic with resistance to mask and vaccine mandates. And one can understand the resistance, but it's so harmful to our common good. And do you have an insight into that?
Yeah,
Can you solve this for us right now, April?
If only, John, if only I had that magic wand. But I can lend some perspective and some things I've learned over the years, working with organizations, but also working in a bunch of different cultures around the world, looking at this from just a lens of whether it's developed countries or developing countries, whether it's men and women. You can think about how we relate to change individually, organizationally, and societally. And we're living through massive changes on all of those levels right now. And in fairness, to some degree, like the human brain is not hardwired to deal with this much change at once. And to some degree, I'm not going to fix that. No one is. But the reality is we know that more change is ahead. So we know we have to level up. And what's interesting is there's such an element. I know we'll talk a little bit about grace later, but there's such an element of grace in some of what's going on, just in terms of like our ability to let go, our ability to say, this is not all mine to figure out. I have to invite others in to help me find this solution. This is not all about me. I have to think about the betterment of other people. Like, it's challenging a lot of the things that we've been socialized to believe matter most. But as a result, if we can actually crack open, which I think the last year and a half has forced us to crack open in lots of different ways, we can start to see more human connection. We can start to see our shared humanity. I'm not convinced we get there, but I'm doing everything I can to be catalyzing and hosting those kinds of conversations.
Great. Well, your book touches on leadership, and you have an interesting concept. And I don't know that I've ever seen it expressed this way, that fast and slow leadership. What the heck is that?
Yeah, so we're all familiar with thinking fast and slow. And
Daniel Kahneman. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And when it comes to leadership, and this is where, so just backing up briefly, in the book, there's the concept of flux, there's the concept of flux mindset, and then there's this concept of the 8 flux superpowers. And the 8 superpowers are sort of the how to thrive in constant change. And one of them, and so this is like, if we're dealing with a world in constant, relentless change, what are the skills and practices and disciplines and habits we need to develop? One of them, I firmly believe, and I love to debate these kinds of things, but I firmly believe that we all need to learn how to run slower. And what I mean by that is, think about what society tells us. When the pace of change increases, we're supposed to run faster and keep up. And yet, we know today that the pace of change, it's never been as fast as it is today, and yet it's likely to never again be this slow. So if we know that we're running fast already today, and yet we're going to have to run faster next week and next year and like for the rest of our lives, that's crazy. Not only is that burnout and exhaustion, but here's the hook with leadership. That means no one can make wise decisions when they're running really fast.
You are so wise to shine a light on this, because our American management models, or Western management models, are the wonder of them is they're pragmatic. They address challenges, and we have this can-do spirit, a kind of New Deal, if you will. FDR was one of my great heroes, or is one of my great heroes. Let's try this, try that, but by God, try something. but we short the act of deliberation. And I think that's what you're getting at. Am I correct, April?
I love this, John. Yes, I'm getting at it's deliberation. It's also, though, how we see. So when you're running constantly fast, running, got to do this, what are you seeing? You're missing most of life. You're not seeing. You have to be able to slow down in order to actually take stock of everything that's going on and realizing what really matters. Because what I think is interesting, we're so focused, we could have a separate conversation, I suppose, on like stocks and flows. But like, we're getting information, we're being bombarded by it every single day. I will admit, maybe I'll be a little bit provocative here. I'll say 99% of that information doesn't really matter. But when we're just trying to consume it as fast as we can and react to all of it, if you learn to slow down, you learn to sort of filter information differently, I would say more responsibly, and you can focus on that fraction of things that actually really matters and that you need to tend to. And
Right.
At a risk, at an extreme, I will often say that when we're running ever faster, the biggest risk we run, that's a tongue twister, the biggest risk we run beyond leadership, beyond management, is we risk running straight past life itself. I mean, this gets very personal very fast in terms of how are you going to spend your one finite, precious life, right?
Right. And well, I will say at my age, things are slowing down, not necessarily intentionally, but also intentionally. It's easier for me to slow down. I have grandkids, so they don't slow me down, but they remind me of where I have been, and I ain't going back. So, and it's a good point. And I think, and it leads to we need to trust ourselves. Would you not say, April? So.
Yes. Trust is another one of the 8 superpowers. And I often will call it the superpower because it powers and fuels so much else. And being able to trust others actually begins with being able to trust yourself.
So now the big contemporary question is, how do we trust one another? And we live in an untrustworthy world, which is proliferated, sadly, with misinformation that masquerades as fact. So,
yes, and I'm gonna provoke a little bit again in the spirit of just wholehearted fleshing out what is really going on. So you're right. We are in a very divided, untrustworthy, untrusting world. I want to posit and put out there that a lot of what we're dealing with right now, it's actually by design. It's not because humans themselves are untrustworthy. So pause for a minute and think that, yes, we are in the midst of a trust crisis, all-time low levels of trust in business and government and media and academia, and new news came out about that just today, and so on and so forth. Fine. I want to ask you, is any human on the planet born untrustworthy? Do you know a single child out there that is untrustworthy? No. Being untrustworthy isn't something inherently human. It's something we teach ourselves. It's something we learn, and it's part of our script, narratives and norms. And I want to put out there that I think part of the problem we're dealing with is that we have designed so many of our systems and institutions from the basic premise that the average individual is not trustworthy. Now, no, I didn't say everybody. I didn't say bad apples don't exist. I said the average individual. So you know what, John? Like right now, I should not trust you. You should not trust me. That's what our script has told us. I mean, background, we can say, okay, I think he's okay and she's okay. Yeah. But the average script says no. And think about what we've just done. We've cut ourselves off from one another right when we could help one another most. And right. So I'm not talking about blind trust or naive trust, but I'm saying, wow, how did we find ourselves in such a mess? But a lot of it is by design. And so we design these systems. We actually can design different ones. And what if we treated untrustworthiness as the exception rather than the rule? That would be a huge change.
That's a good thing. And as you were speaking, I was going to sort of, in a way, take back some of what I said, because I don't disagree with anything that you're saying. But I do believe, and this is why I have explored the idea of grace, is that, and grace and trust would be intertwined. And as you and I were talking before the show, I do believe there is more good in the world than there is evil. Evil just makes headlines. So
Exactly.
good doesn't sell.
Exactly.
But I think one-on-one we do trust one another until proven otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But you are absolutely right. We are conditioned to be skeptical, and that's not all bad. But when we become manipulated, and if we're talking scripts and we're talking systems, that's a form of manipulation. Would you agree? So
yes, and I think part of the challenge we're in, taking not a tangent, but the role of technology, which can actually distance us from one another. And we have a lot of proxies out there for what we should and shouldn't trust, which may or may not be accurate. I find they're often not accurate, versus when you can actually have a human one-on-one conversation with somebody, even if you don't agree with them, it's not about a lack of trust. There's this sense of, oh, you have a different script, you have a different story to tell, but if I can understand your story, I can really understand why you might be believing what you believe today. I can really understand. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I'm saying we're missing. That's the piece we're missing. And technology makes it ever easier. I mean, classic case of technology can unite us, but it can also divide us. Right. And so I think that that's a huge source of fuel, if you will, for the fires of division that are burning today.
Right. Well, there's something that's just the byproduct of this mistrust. And I think this is where your work is good. And it was Arthur C. Brooks and his book on kindness, and I'm forgetting the title. He talked, once upon a time, you could have disagreements with someone. And now, if on certain issues, whatever, you and I may disagree and we walk away. But we are conditioned in a way to begin to feel contempt for you. And when I feel contempt for another person, I'm dehumanizing you. And when I dehumanize you, you become dead to me, or I can do whatever I want. And that's very frightening. And I think technology, in a way, fosters that with its icons and looking at things through very narrow lenses. So we need you, April.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you realized what you just did, John, but you took us into another Flux superpower, the seventh one, which is Be All the More Human, which focuses directly on our relationship to technology and the tension that we have in that we're spending ever more time with our devices and ever less time with one another. And what that is doing, not just the dehumanization and the othering is a key part. Also, though, and I'm, for me, the question that I'm always asking every time is, how does this help us navigate change? What happens when change hits? And what's fascinating, and it's a little bit of a tangent, but I want to bring it up because it tends to be interesting to people. The more technology we have in our pocket, the more devices or the more apps on our devices, whatever, the more we sort of have developed this belief, which is an illusion, but this belief that we can somehow control what's going to happen. Like,
good thought. I actually had not thought of that, but you're right. Sadly, I wish you were totally wrong, but you're not. So
yeah, and it's interesting though, because it's like, oh, something changed. This app will fix it. That app will fix, whatever. Mm-hmm. And yet there's no human in any of that. But then also when the change really hits, as over the last 20 months, you realize no amount of apps in your pocket is actually going to change this sense of flux and whatnot. But, and here I want to come back to trust. What does trust help us do? Trust helps us navigate change better. So think about over the last, could be the last 20 months or at any point in your life, actually, when change has really hit, who did you turn to? Chances are you turned to your trusted relationships. And if you didn't have many, or for someone who doesn't have many, they're in a world of hurt far greater than those who do. So I bring this up because without trust, there's no ability to navigate change well on your own, but especially with others. And yet when you find groups or cultures or communities where trust is high, change may hit and it may be hard, it may be scary and all the rest. But when you know that you're not in this alone and that you have a trusted group of humans, not apps, not devices, that you can work with to move through it, you will do better. You will perform better on any metric. And we can also apply this, of course, to organizations and organizational culture. And it plays out in lots of different ways.
That's great. You have an intriguing turn of phrase that caught my eye. We're familiar with the phrase letting go of the past. You say letting go of the future. What the heck is that?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked. So this superpower, letting go of the future, is all about our relationship to control. So it's a perfect echo of what I was just saying. And it does not mean failure. It does not mean giving up. It does not mean doomsdaying. Let me explain. Because I often get, so as a futurist, people often say to me, like, you're a futurist. You can't say that. You're not allowed, right? And I'm like, well, wait, let me explain. So
they will revoke your membership in the futurist society.
I know. But then they hear me out and they're like, good point. Okay. So it stems from not just my concern, but the observation and the challenge that we face collectively. Humans tend to really not like change, not only that we can't control, but that we don't expect, right? We like to be able to control and predict what's going to happen. We do not like it when things don't go to plan. And yet we know that that's not the reality of much of life. And we are so, pardon my speech, we are so hell-bent on trying to predict and control and engineer the future. But we don't fully appreciate that we have very little, if any, control over what happens. And rather than trying to predict the future, so it's like, I need the future, like there's one future and it's got to go this way and it's got to go my way. And if anything other than that happens, we kind of unravel and fall apart. We get really anxious. Letting go of the future enables a better future to emerge. So it's letting go of the need or the belief that you can predict the future, and rather opening yourself up and preparing for many different possible futures, which is a very
I think what you're saying, I love letting go of the future, but in a way it's preparing yourself for change because it's inevitable. So again, get over it. You're much more eloquent than I am.
Well, it's this sense of letting go of the singular future. It has to go this way. No. Let me tell you, as a futurist, however you think the future is going to turn out, it's going to be different. But when you shift from this need or this obsession with predicting the future to preparing for many different possible futures, all of a sudden you find it's really liberating. It's really empowering. You can cast a range of scenarios that might happen. None of them probably will happen exactly as you think, but you can start preparing. You can start developing, what would we do then? And organizationally, obviously it's helpful, but even you can do this to your own life. And so you end up being much more, I want to go beyond resilient, much more excited about a range of possible futures that could play out.
That's great. Well, I could keep on talking to you for hours, but we have a limited time, and I know you have a lot more better things to do. But I always ask our guests a story about grace. Is there something you wish to share with us, April?
Yeah, there is, actually. I was thinking about this, and it didn't come up in our conversation yet, but it does sometimes. And people often ask me, like, why I got started writing this book. So it relates actually directly to Flux. And I mentioned that my journey to Flux began nearly 3 decades ago. And at that time, when I was in college, both of my parents died in a car accident. And that was really my entry or my baptism into Flux. Like, everything changed. Like, How do I rebuild my family? What do I do about my grief? How do I think about my career? Like, everything. And I realize now that that's when I began peeling back the layers of this onion of, like, what do you do when you don't know what to do? And what do you do when your entire world and future just like melted? And the grace that I experienced in not just the immediate aftermath, but in all 27 years since that happened is nothing short of remarkable. So I can say, I'll just focus on the goodness of humans that showed up in that aftermath of my parents' death, which led completely to where I am today. So I like to say, without grace, not only would Flux as a book not exist, but none of these ideas that we're talking about today. So grace has been such a driver in my whole life, but that's where I think it got distilled most.
What a beautiful thought. Out of tragedy, you were shown kindness and intentionality and grace. And look at all that you have accomplished and all that you're teaching us, April. April, how can we find you? So I will put the notes in the file.
Yeah. So thankfully I get to joke about this. As far as I'm aware, no one has my name. So I'm super easy to find. So if you want to know more about Flux, go to fluxmindset.com. If you want to know more about me, aprilrinne.com. So just first name, last name. And I am April Rinne on all social media channels. You can find and follow me there. And if anyone wants to email me, I'm april@aprilrinne.com.
April, it's terrific. And with that, I'm going to sign out and I say thank you.
Thank you so much, John.